Good evening, everybody. My name is Gabrielle Duffy, and I am a clinical psychologist and the clinical manager of the Early Start Australia clinic that's opened up at Manly, up at beautiful North Head. Um, and I'm going to be talking tonight about helping young children with autism to thrive. Thank you so much, everybody, for finding the time and space in your no doubt very busy lives to kind of take the time out to sit down and either watch me, or if you're watching this at a later time, just finding time in your life at all to actually sit through this presentation. I really appreciate it. And please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. And then after the presentation, we'll provide some like a little bit of summary of the key points, and then any information that you might want, or any kind of contact details that you might want if you want to pursue any of the things that I've talked about further. So I guess some of you are here because you may already have a child that's diagnosed with autism. Some of you might be just here because you've got a few concerns about your child. Some of you might be here because you've got like a family friend or a grandchild, or and some of you might just be here because you're interested to find out a bit more about autism. So whatever reason that you're here, I hope that kind of this will give you a little bit of information and a few kind of pointers about where to go, or at least where to go to have some of your questions answered. I will just be referring to a little bit of a presentation, but I won't actually put it up on the screen. I guess I just wanted to start by saying that I've been around a pretty long time. I've been a child psychologist for over 30 years, working with little ones with autism and a whole range of difficulties over that time. And since I first trained, there have been a lot of, I guess, changes in not only, I guess, how we kind of diagnose autism, but also in terms of how we kind of perceive the overall kind of idea of what it means to be autistic. And also I've seen kind of, I guess, a lot of changes in terms of the sorts of interventions and therapies that people have kind of talked about as being effective. So I'm very, very aware that there's kind of like, it's a bit of a moving feast, and that's a good thing, because with more and more research, we find out more and more about autism and the things that are going to work. I also just want to start by saying that obviously every child with autism is different. And having seen so many children with autism in my career, I can honestly attest to that no two children with autism are the same. Even though that they share some common characteristics, they have many, many differences, their own little individual personalities. Some have got kind of a really high level of symptoms in one area, but a really low level in other areas. And I think any discussion around what's the best way to help a child with autism thrive really needs to take into account that every child is so different, and it really needs to be really individualized. I guess also you probably, we call it autism spectrum disorder, because not only is every child with autism different, but I guess the way in which that autism affects their functioning is very, very different. And for some children, it can have a relatively mild impact on their functioning, and for other children it can have a really severe impact on their functioning, and that's now reflected in the way we talk about different levels of autism. In terms of how many children kind of have autism, the World Health Organization talks about it being around 1 in 100, but Autism Spectrum Australia talks about it being higher than that and being more like 1 in 70. And certainly, I guess, our ability to kind of recognize and diagnose autism over the last sort of 20 or 30 years has seen to a slight increase in the rate of autism. And so it's somewhere between sort of 1 in 70 to 1 in 100 kids will have autism. And interestingly, 31% of all NDIS participants will have a primary diagnosis of autism. So it is a kind of, a really, I guess, significant diagnosis in terms of kind of how the services that we need and the support that quite a large number of children actually have. And obviously it's a lifelong condition, so those needs will continue into kind of their teenage years and into adulthood. I guess in terms of how we now identify autism, as I said, the way in which we identify autism has changed a little bit over the years, and there's been a shift in terms of what some of those diagnostic criteria are. And many of you would have heard that it was about 10 years ago now, that the whole kind of concept of Asperger's, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, was kind of taken out of the main diagnostic manual that we use to diagnose autism, and no longer is kind of around, although many kind of, older adolescents and adults will very much still identify with that diagnosis of Asperger's, and I'm sure all of you have met people who have that diagnosis and it kind of really fits for them. But these days we don't actually diagnose Asperger's. And there was also something called pervasive developmental disability not otherwise specified, which also was removed in the 2013 review. And interestingly, I guess there's been a real increase in adults, seeking a diagnosis, and often it can come after one of their children has been diagnosed. The whole process of going through, having your child diagnosed with autism can sometimes lead adults to start to wonder a bit more about themselves and some of the challenges that they've had and some of their particular, traits that they may have. And this can sometimes then lead to some adults actually pursuing and sometimes getting a diagnosis for themselves as well. The main way in Australia, the main kind of criteria that we follow is something called DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual, which is a very big word, based on the sort of American classification system. And I guess what we do now know from the research is that autism can be diagnosed quite early. And in fact, by the age of about 1, there can be some really, really clear signs. That doesn't mean it is always diagnosed really early. In fact, there's often a real lag between when people are concerned and raise these concerns with a health professional and when the diagnosis actually happens. And that's a whole complicated set of reasons. But certainly now the research is saying that from really about 1, we can, particularly for children who are sort of level 2 or 3, we can really kind of, probably diagnose or at least see some kind of really clear symptoms that are going to require some intervention. I guess the sorts of things that parents can maybe be concerned about that might start to raise some alarm bells it might be a delay in speech and language development. It might be a delay in how the child's using gestures, that they're not doing things like waving or pointing to things or using the gestures that children often will start to use even before they have a lot of language. And just that kind of whole non-verbal communication just seems a little bit kind of delayed or a little bit unusual. For some, it might be that their child doesn't seem to be that interested in other children and is very, very happy to kind of just be by themselves doing their own thing and doesn't seem to show a lot of interest in other children. And then kind of challenges with, copying and imitating things. So not only are they not using gestures or, when an adult points, they may not point, or when an adult waves, they may not wave back, or they might just not imitate more basic things like kind of, sticking their tongue out or doing things with their face or, clapping in songs and things. Now, no one of these things by itself is kind of a diagnostic, criteria for autism, but if a child is presenting with a few of these, and that can often be the sorts of things that parents are a little bit concerned about, or educators or other family members. And I guess the other area that sometimes comes up and often comes up is that they may have a child that seems to have very sort of repetitive, kind of almost ritualistic behaviors around certain things. Some kind of very unusual sensory kind of interests, or some things that they're either really avoiding or some things that they're really seeking out in a sensory way. And also something else that sometimes comes up is a child that really needs to have things done in an incredibly routine way and gets really quite distressed if that routine is changed. As I said before, no one of these things by itself is a diagnostic criteria, but if you're starting to get a few of those kind of those things happening in a child, then sometimes that can lead to kind of, some concerns for parents, educators, and maybe, to start to seek out some kind of input from a health professional. I'm just going to check the chat every now and then, so excuse me if I just scroll down just to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. Okay, awesome. So I guess if you're sitting there and you are a parent that's kind of here because you're a little bit worried about your child and are they developing normally, as I said, no, one of those things is an issue. But if you're starting to think, oh gosh, my child has got kind of a few of those things going on, then maybe that might warrant getting a little bit of, I guess, further advice about where you can go to actually kind of get that looked at. And of course, little children are so varied and show so many of their own little quirks. And, most children will have some of these things at some stage. And it's only when they kind of start to come together and they become this quite sort of consistent sort of pattern that you would really start to be concerned. Um, I guess the other issue with autism is that it often, well, it nearly always, in fact, comes with some other co-occurring conditions. We call it comorbidity or co-occurring things. So this might be that the child also has an intellectual disability. It might be in little people, they call it a developmental delay, whereas in children sort of over about 5 or 6, once it's kind of affecting all their areas of development, it might be called an intellectual disability. But not all children with autism have an intellectual disability, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It might come with a language disorder, and that's probably often the thing that it does come with is because communication is such a core part of the challenges with autism. A language disorder is often something that sits with it. And it may also come with things like ADHD, anxiety, OCD. So I guess that once you have any kind of, I guess, condition like autism, then the chances that you're going to have something else going along with it increase as well. And then there are some other kind of just physical issues that kids with autism seem to have more, a sort of higher prevalence of, like things like gastrointestinal issues seem to have a higher rate in children with autism. Um, so I guess that's why it's so important to kind of be very holistic when we're looking at these kids and make sure that we're really getting a good sense of what all their needs are and not just the autistic behaviours. The other area which I touched on before and which is fairly common is sensory experiences. Now, obviously, in children with autism, the sensory kind of experiences that they have, again, can be just so different depending on the child. It it can range from children who are actually seeking out huge amounts of sensory input, or children who are kind of quite avoidant of types of input. And sometimes you get those things all mixed up together. So you might have a child, for example, that is seeking out lots of sort of visual input, loves to look at lights, likes to hold their hands up and see lights in a certain way, and seek out a lot of that, but then is very sensitive to things like noise and very avoidant of it. And also, it's not just things like vision and sound and smells. It can be things like touch, and it can also be things like seeking out a lot of movement, and it can also be things like seeking out a lot of pressure into the muscles and joints, or avoiding those things. And every child is a little bit different. But obviously, these sensory needs really impact children's functionings, and we really need to kind of get a really good sense of what's going on. Because they can really get in the way of lots of different tasks. So, for example, if a child can't stand having their hair touched, or can't stand having water around their face, then that could really impact things like being able to actually wash their hair and have haircuts and things like that, or even just having baths and showers can be really challenging. Children that find oral sort of textures really kind of, unpleasant or uncomfortable may then develop some really significant issues with eating. So it can impact, a whole range of different things if you've got some sensory stuff going on. I guess something that you probably have heard a bit about if you've kind of been, thinking much about autism, is this whole idea, and I think it's out there in the mainstream kind of media a lot as well, about kind of neurodiversity, which is kind of, a word that is, I now hear probably nearly every single day. And I think it's kind of reflects a real shift in how we're seeing conditions like autism, and a kind of really positive shift. And now we talk a lot about needing to be sort of neuroaffirming in how we work with children and adults with autism. And that's been a real shift since I started my work as a psychologist, definitely, that, autism was sort of a disorder which needed to be fixed. And I think we now so know that's not true. And that in fact it comes with, quite a lot of strengths for a lot of people, and quite a lot of, and can bring a very different way of looking at things to the world. And so I think now it's really important that when we're talking about helping children to thrive and adults to thrive, that we really are embracing these neuroaffirming approaches, which kind of see autism not so much as it's not a mental illness or a mental disorder, but it's kind of just a different way of thinking, learning, and interacting with the world. And really even calling it a disorder is kind of really not kind of probably the right thing to be doing, because it's just a way of differently interacting and seeing the world. And I think intervention for autism now is kind of about finding that place where we're not trying to change or kind of totally, modify these kind of autistic behaviors, but kind of actually find a place where they just don't get significantly in the way of a child or an adult's functioning, and so they can still learn to be, to do all the things they need to do to be included and to really participate in life. And I guess it's much more now about, what are the goals that a family is really wanting for their child, in terms of helping that child to kind of be the best person that they can, to be included in the things that are important for that child and that family, and not so much about kind of trying to stop or change or divert some of these autistic behaviors. And that's, I know, it can be quite controversial. It can be a little bit tricky at times to find that right balance. But I think it's really, really important to think about that when we're working with any child with autism. I think there's a lot of misconceptions that have been around. And again, some of these have probably changed since I started working. I think when I started working 30 years ago, there was definitely this idea of kind of really the classically autistic child, whereas I think we now know there's almost no such thing as a classically autistic child, because they all are all so different. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that most people with autism also have an intellectual disability. In fact, yes, there is a significant proportion of children with autism. It's around about 31% will have an intellectual disability. But that means that the vast majority of people with autism won't necessarily have an intellectual disability. There will be about 25% of these kids who don't have an intellectual disability, but sort of have slightly slower cognitive development. Talk about this, this sort of more borderline ability, kind of being in that grey zone. So they still do learn a little bit more slowly, but it's not an intellectual disability. But that leaves the vast majority, around 44% of people with autism, do not have an intellectual disability. They have an IQ or cognitive ability that's kind of broadly within the average, or, sometimes the above average range. And any of you that know children with autism will see that sometimes they have quite patchy cognitive development. They've got some incredible skills in some areas and then some challenges in other areas. So it can be a little bit patchy. I think another misconception is that, for a child or maybe even an adult who has autism and is nonverbal and not speaking, there can be an assumption that they also don't understand what's being said to them, and that research is showing that can be really, really wrong. And even nonverbal autistic children and adults can actually be understanding far more than what they're actually saying. Another misconception is that autistic people don't experience a full range of emotions. I think that's absolutely a misconception that we've kind of thrown out now. And in fact, they can have incredibly rich emotional lives, but struggle sometimes to interpret their emotional world. And in fact, they can experience the full range of emotions that all other children experience as well. And I think another, definitely a big misconception, and probably something that when I started my practice was very much around, is this idea that, they can't be autistic because, they actually are connected and they have an attachment to their parents and to their family. That's probably a really big misconception. And in fact, autistic children and autistic adults can have incredibly close connections with people who are familiar and they feel safe with. And even, the little ones that I work with, even the children who are kind of, really, sort of level 3, are often incredibly connected and really seek out their their preferred figures within their family. And in fact, research around attachment shows that can have the same attachment styles as other children. It can just sometimes be expressed a little bit differently, but they are very much capable of having strong attachments and connections to others. I wanted to talk a little bit now, I guess, about identification and diagnosis. I think I talked before about the fact that parents often have some concerns quite early on, but in fact, the age of diagnosis in Australia, the average age is around about 4, whereas parents have often had concerns for kind of a couple of years before the diagnosis is given. And that, again, is for a whole combination of reasons. It's very difficult to kind of get in to see pediatricians. It's very expensive to get a diagnosis in the beginning. There are really long waiting lists in the public system, and even privately it can be really, really difficult. And also sometimes parents are being kind of, I guess, told a lot of things like, oh, he's a boy, he'll talk later, or, it's because he's the third child and his older siblings are talking for them, or, often even health professionals will give a lot of kind of, I guess, reassurances, when in fact sometimes there is quite a clear cluster of red flags that this child really does need some really significant intervention. So there are some very kind of strict and, I guess, gold standard criteria for how we go about diagnosing autism. Doesn't always happen in that way, I would have to say. In fact, a lot of the time it doesn't. But really, in order to sort of diagnose a child with autism, the ideal is to have a multidisciplinary team, usually with a psychologist, a speech therapist, a paediatrician if possible, and to really follow some quite strict guidelines, to use some fairly well-researched tools. And when I say tools, I mean like assessment protocols. And there's one which is called the ADOS, which is probably the gold standard assessment, which is done with the child and their carer and looks at a whole lot of domains and rates it very, very specifically. Now, a lot of kids will have an ADOS, but not all children will end up with an ADOS to get a diagnosis of autism. And there are some new tests coming out as well. But certainly there are guidelines in place and they should really be followed. And I think because, as I said before, there's often a kind of combination of challenges. There might be the autism, there might also be the child's cognitive level, there might be a language disorder, there might be some anxiety, there might be some attentional issues. It's really, really helpful and really, really important that the child is looked at very holistically and that all those issues are kind of looked at and disentangled. And also to rule out that it might not, that it's not something else that's actually causing some of these issues. That's really, really important as well, because autism can overlap a lot with other, other childhood disorders, and really having someone that can really look very holistically and look at the whole picture in terms of what other things it might be is really important as well. I guess so. I guess in terms of kind of interventions now, obviously there are a whole array of, I guess, interventions that have been, I guess, put forward as being helpful for autism. And certainly in my 30 years, I have seen children who have done so many different things, from swimming with dolphins to sound therapy to ABA to group therapy to floor time. I mean, there are so many different kind of things around. I think parents must just get so bombarded and so overwhelmed when they get that diagnosis about what's the best way to move forward with this child. There are national guidelines in terms of looking at treatments and preferably going for evidence-based treatments, but sometimes the evidence is not, always super clear, and sometimes the research that has been done has got some challenges. So it can be a real minefield for parents who are really trying to move forward and look at, okay, what's the best way to help my child? Just going to check again to make sure that there's no questions that I've missed. Okay, that's okay. And I think just as every child with autism is different, every child with autism is growing in a family, and every family is different as well. And so, what is going to work for one family is not going to work for another family, and what is going to work for one child is not going to work for another child. So, there's definitely no one size um, fits all approach. It's really needs to be individualized to what's going to work for that child and that family. Some families can afford, in terms of time and resources, to be doing really intensive therapy for 30 hours a week. Other families have got so many different commitments. They might have a number of children, they might be incredibly time poor, and they might be really resource poor, and there's no way they can commit to sort of huge numbers of therapy a week. And so everybody has to find their way through. Um, I guess not all therapies have been tested, I should say that. Like, a lot of therapies really haven't been tested. Um, and I guess parents need to just make decisions once they've read all the research based on a combination of what's going to work in terms of what the research says, but what's going to work for their family, what's going to work in terms of their other children, because obviously, if you've got a few children, then actually, you've got to really make sure that those children's needs don't get ignored as well, because the child who has been diagnosed with autism has so many overwhelming therapy needs. Um, I guess in terms of the different areas of intervention, I mean, there are so many different ones. There are interventions which focus mainly on kind of training parents up to almost be the therapist for their child. So that's kind of that very sort of parent-led stuff. There are interventions which we would sort of categorize as being behavioral, and I guess things like ABA might fit into that. I know that ABA is a bit of a controversial area at the moment. Some people kind of, absolutely love ABA, and other people have kind of put forward some arguments as to why it might not be such a great thing. And look, that's probably true with lots of the therapies that are around, but certainly those sorts of behavioural interventions are very much about breaking down behaviours into tiny little steps and then trying to teach children some alternative, more productive, more functional behaviours. And that's, I guess, a whole nother area of discussion. Relationship-based interventions, where it's much more around kind of making that connection and making that relationship with the child. Things like floor time are very relationship-based, and really trying to then use that relationship in order to kind of then try and teach the child skills and to work on some of those functional goals. There are sensory interventions, sensory diets. Occupational therapists will often work a lot around sensory interventions in terms of actually trying to, I guess, increase the child's ability to tolerate, I guess, unpleasant sensory experiences, and I guess reduce the child's tendency to seek out huge amounts of input. And that's very much about working with the child's kind of regulation system and their sensory system and helping it to settle and to kind of, I guess, calm down a little bit. Um, Another area which is, I guess, the area which ESDM, which is a therapy we offer at our clinic at Manly, falls under, is something which is called naturalistic developmental behavioural interventions. And I guess these kind of interventions take on parts of some of the other things that I've spoken about, but very much try to embed, I guess, therapy or intervention in the day-to-day tasks that the child's doing in their natural environment. So yes, it's still looking at behaviour. Yes, it's still looking at teaching the child more functional behaviours. But it's trying to do it in a very kind of naturalistic way. It also has a lot of relationship-based stuff in it. And really, like, how can we actually do therapy in a way so the child almost doesn't feel like they're having therapy? So how can we intertwine these kind of techniques when they're having a bath? How can we integrate these things into meal times? How can we integrate these strategies into every time the child wants a particular toy or activity or a snack? So just kind of, it's not about coming and sitting down for, blocks of time and doing particular tasks, but just trying to do it in a very naturalistic kind of way within the child's environments of home, preschool, and also obviously in the clinic. And then there's a whole lot of other alternative therapies too, that kind of have kind of come and go in terms of kind of their strength and how much they're used. You know, there's things like sound therapy or massage or reflexology, and I certainly am not dissing any of these things, because I guess for certain children, some of these things can really add to their kind of therapy program. And then I guess the last area is that whole area of pharmacological intervention or medication, which I know that a number of children with autism do end up at least trialing some medications. It might be something like, you know, using melatonin to help with sleep, or it might be some more kind of, I guess, significant kind of psychostimulant medications to help with behavior or attention, to just kind of calm their whole system down, or it might be stronger medications to help with sleep. So that's a whole another area. And I think for many children and for many families, they're kind of using a number of these different approaches that I've just talked about to try and kind of get the best outcomes for their child. So I guess that leaves, you know, families a little bit overwhelmed at times. You know, you read about all of these interventions. Should I go with the kind of, you know, the ABA approach? Should I go with medication? Should I go with a much more naturalistic kind of embedded in environment approach? Should I kind of, this friend told me about this great kind of chiropractor, should I go with that one? It's incredibly overwhelming to actually pick interventions, and that's often on top of just your standard things like speech therapy and occupational therapy, which a number of children will start with. And I guess, you know, you've got to think about things like cost. You know, a lot of these therapies are expensive and they need to be very regular. So that's obviously one big factor to take into account. The location and proximity to home, you know, if you've got to get a child to a therapy centre and you've got other children, or you're working, then doing something which is actually going to work and isn't going to be like an hour each way, both for you and for your child, is probably something to really think about as well. Having said that, some families will travel, you know, an hour and a half to a clinic to get an intervention that they really feel works for them. And I guess kind of sometimes it's just determined by when can I get an appointment, you know. This might be the intervention that you really think is going to work, but they've got a waiting list of 6 months, so it's not something that's kind of available or open to you. So I guess, you know, it is a bit of a minefield, as I was saying, in terms of working out the best way forward. And everybody will have their own opinion about what's the best thing to do. And I guess as parents, you've just got to try and find the thing that's going to work for you and your family. Okay. So as I said, the different options, usually parents will start with a speech therapist, because often that delayed language is the first red flag that people pick up on. They may then end up with an OT because of some sensory issues, perhaps a psychologist because there might be some behavioural challenges, or maybe the child isn't kind of, you know, toilet training, or maybe the child won't get their hair washed, or maybe the child's having major meltdowns, or maybe the child's running off. So a psychologist can help with some of those more behavioural things. ESDM, as I mentioned before, the Early Start Denver model is a kind of multidisciplinary intervention which takes components of, I guess, you know, speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavioural therapy, early childhood learning, and integrates them all into the one sort of therapeutic program. And a lot of these therapies now, and I think particularly since COVID, can be delivered. Obviously, you know, face-to-face and in person is probably preferable, but there's been huge advances in terms of being able to do these therapies via telehealth or teletherapy, and in training up parents to be able to actually do some of these things using telehealth. And I've certainly been working a lot more in this way in the last couple of years, and, you know, getting a lot better at it. And I think we're all learning ways that kind of work to make this much more effective. There are autism specific early learning centres, there are specialist playgroups around, there are kind of very intensive ABA models, which are those very structured approaches to kind of dealing with the behaviours that you're wanting to teach or behaviours you're wanting to change. And then there's also some allied health assistants who can kind of come into preschools or come into childcare centres and under the direction of an allied health person be actually delivering a program. And it's just that it's more cost effective. Okay. So I guess thinking about all the different therapies that are around, I think, as parents, you have to kind of think about looking at the evidence, which of these therapies have got evidence for actually working. Maybe looking for teams where you have multidisciplinary teams, so that you have a team which has got maybe a psychologist, speech therapist, OT, early childhood educator, so that you can have a team that are really communicating, talking about your child, looking at all the areas of need and not just honing in on one particular thing. And it's so helpful. I find as a clinical psychologist, it's so helpful to have some input from an OT or to have the lens of a speech therapist. And they find it really helpful sometimes as well to have the perspective of myself as a psychologist. And I think it really enhances outcomes for these kids to have a multidisciplinary team. Having parents involved, and I really can't stress that enough. You guys as parents are the ones that are spending the absolute vast majority of time with your child. And yes, therapists can seem like the experts in what to do with autism, but you're the ones that are going home and dealing with them for the other 23 hours of the day. And so being very involved and being trained up in using the techniques that the therapists are using, I think is just so important. I think, just actually finding that you feel comfortable in the environment and comfortable with the person that is doing the therapy with your child, and just observing your child's responses to that person and whether they feel comfortable with them. I mean, obviously it can take a few sessions to feel that way, but just really making sure you feel that you're comfortable, that it feels like the right fit. And if it's not, then, maybe it is about looking for a different therapist or a different service. And I think the other thing which I touched on before is really making sure that the therapy that you're doing is really neuroaffirming, and that it's not about trying to kind of get rid of or totally change some of these behaviors, but really kind of accepting your child for the amazing, quirky, fantastic little person that they are, and really focusing on skills and goals that are going to really enhance their day-to-day living and functioning. So I guess really that's kind of all I really wanted to talk about today. I'll just quickly mention that there are obviously lots of supports around now for families who are trying to navigate this journey, and there is Aspect is a really good starting place. Getting in touch with a clinic like our clinic, which is ESA at Manly, if you've just got some questions or you're wanting to kind of start the process or think about diagnosis, or don't quite know how to get started with NDIS, then ringing a therapy centre is a really good way to start as well. Getting in touch with the NDIS coordinator in your area, if you Google it, you can find out who that is. All of these people can not necessarily answer all your questions, but really help with getting some of your questions answered and getting you on the right path so that your child can thrive. I'm just going to check down now again to see if anybody has any questions. Please feel free, if you do have any questions, to put them in the chat. Can't actually see that there's any questions that have come up. Okay, I see that somebody's just put up a question around what's the best way to get started on this journey, and that's a really good question. And I think if you have got some concerns about your little one, or if some of the stuff that I'm talking about tonight is kind of ringing some bells for you, or maybe you've got like a friend who's got a child and you're kind of seeing some things and wondering, I think just basically getting in touch with a health professional, whether it be your local GP as a start, or whether it be contacting, I mean, paediatricians are so hard to get into at the moment. I know, and developmental paediatricians in particular are really hard to get into. You can always contact our clinic at Manly, and we will provide the contact details in the links afterwards, to talk about actually just starting to have a chat about your child and what some of the concerns are. You can also contact Aspect if that's something that, if you want to actually go ahead with an assessment, or contact us at ESA and we can actually start the whole ball rolling with doing an assessment if that seems to be warranted. Because, you know, all the staff at our clinic, and there are other clinics as well that kind of work extensively with little ones with autism, are pretty good at picking up kind of, I guess, you know, what some of the red flags are, and kind of suggesting, look, yeah, I think this is something that we do need to look into further. I think this child does need to have maybe the full workup in terms of doing something like an ADOS. And sometimes it's incredibly clear if a child has autism, and sometimes it's a lot more complicated. Sometimes, you know, I can tell within 10 minutes of meeting a child that they have autism, and other times it's like, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 sessions. So I think just contacting your GP, contacting our clinic at Manly, if you have a paediatrician that you've already have a relationship with, just starting that conversation about, is this a possibility? And then starting the process of getting an assessment done. The good thing about, I guess, with NDIS with little ones is that you don't need to actually have the diagnosis in order to get onto the NDIS for children under 7, and they're actually going to be raising that age to 9 in quite soon, I think. So even if you don't actually have a diagnosis, but you can establish that there are some clear delays, you can still start that application process. And even if it might be that somebody's flagged that an assessment might be needed, that can go into your NDIS kind of application as well. It might be, we're kind of, speech and language delay, there's some sensory issues, and we are pursuing a assessment for ASD. Even if you don't have that diagnosis, that can also, though, help with your NDIS application. So I hope that's helped answer that question. And we will put the contact details if anybody does want to contact our clinic at Manly, ESA Manly, or just have a Google of the website and have a look to see what sorts of things are around in terms of both assessment and intervention. Please feel free to do that as well. Okay. Okay, somebody's just asked a question about an older child, like an 11-year-old, and I know it's a really good question because I know that a lot of children are being diagnosed now later, and someone's just asked about resources to explain to family members, and there are so many resources around. It's kind of a bit almost overwhelming. Some of them are fantastic. We can certainly put some resources in the link when this is over. There's some fantastic YouTube videos that actually explain autism. There are some YouTube videos which are to explain autism to the child with autism, and also really helpful for explaining to other children about what autism is, and also explaining to family members. And we can definitely put some links in and some information about resources to try and explain to people about ASD. But certainly there are books, there are brochures, and some of the little animated YouTube videos are fantastic. And we'll see if we can put some of those together for you. And I think another question that often comes up, I don't know if any of you have this question, is I'll see children who've had a diagnosis since they were sort of 3, and the child's now 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and the parents are going, we've actually never told them that they're autistic, and how do we actually tell them? And some parents are actually quite adamant they don't necessarily want their child to know, whereas others really want to start having that conversation with their child. And some of those resources, there's some great resources around for that as well. And again, it's not necessarily around telling a child straight up you have autism, but talking about brains and talking about different brains and talking about how all brains work differently and what strengths are and how your brain might be a little bit different. And there's some great resources around that as well. Okay, I'm just checking again to see if anybody's from what age should you start looking into things? That's a really good question. Look, as an early intervention specialist, I would just say the earlier the better. I think as I'd said before, research is actually showing that we can pick up autism now from really about the age of 1. There are even sort of from about 9 months, there are some really clear red flags. And then by kind of 12 months and 12 to 18 months, we can really often see that there are a number of signs and symptoms there that are likely to lead to a diagnosis. So even if a diagnosis isn't made that young, I think getting intervention happening from the earliest age possible. The research shows that the earlier you start, I guess the better the outcomes are going to be. So I think the minute there are any concerns, start getting some intervention happening, and just start educating yourself and start kind of getting some support for language and communication. So with ESDM, which is the model that we use, we see little ones from about 15 to 18 months. And I guess I know it's quite rare for children to be picked up that young and be diagnosed, but sometimes there are families where there's already a child with autism and then another child comes along. And the parent can kind of see that there are really some concerns, so they get in really, really quickly. And then for other children, there are even if it's their first child, there are some really significant concerns quite early. So really, things like ESDM can start to be really effective from about 15 to 18 months. So yeah, the earlier the better is what I would say in terms of intervention, but never too late. Never too late to start either. Okay. Okay. Right, well, there doesn't seem to be any more kind of questions or comments in the chat, but please, we will, the team will kind of be checking in, and if there are any more questions or any more comments afterwards, you can add those. And I think this video is going to be available, and we will add a link to further information in terms of if anybody wants to get in touch or contact our clinic, or maybe find out a bit more about resources or any of those things people have asked about, please feel free to follow that up. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening tonight. I know how hard it is, as I said before, to find time out of your crazy lives. So thank you so much. And we look forward, if any of you have any more questions or just want to ring and have a chat or got any concerns, we at Early Start Australia, we'd love to be able to help you out if we can. So thank you so much, and I hope you all get a good night's sleep, because I know you mums need it. Thanks very much.